Welcome to EPG Pathshala. My name is Raghuram Raju from University of Hyderabad. We are discussing the module Multiculturalism and Minority Rights. This module is written by Professor Sonia Sikka. One way to begin with the discussion on multiculturalism is to look at two senses of this term. The first sense of the term refers to the existence of cultural diversity within political units such as the nation state. So, for instance, there is a nation state that consists of several cultural groups, and that can be considered as a nation with different cultures, or what is called as multicultural society. The second sense of multiculturalism particularly refers to a political doctrine that has developed through critical engagement with liberalism. That is, its main aim is to formulate a model that would accommodate diversity. In doing so, the doctrine prescribes certain social and political practices, and the present module discusses this in detail. The reason why we need to discuss this in detail is the problem associated with the requirements of liberalism. Liberalism presupposes homogenized autonomous individual, and if individuals are autonomous and homogeneous, then they don't belong to any culture. This led to a serious problem. The problem is that normatively liberal doctrine is very good, but then it does not have descriptions of actual societies. If you look at actual societies, individuals are not all the time autonomous, nor are they atomized individuals. Individuals are anchored into cultural groups. They are born into a society, they are born into a family, they belong to a particular linguistic group, they belong to different kind of regions, and so on and so forth. So there is a huge chasm between what ought to be the case and what is the case. Liberalism largely has been successful with regard to the former, namely what ought to be the case. Whereas in the case of what is the case, they do not have proper descriptions of actual societies. So given this kind of a predicament associated with liberalism, you have multiculturalists who try to bring onto the table, particularly in relation to liberalism, the kind of limitations the doctrine has. And then it is in this context the multiculturalists try to show that societies or political units consist of not merely atomized individuals but cultural groups. So this becomes a serious problem both in the Western societies and more so with regard to the non-Western societies like India and so on and so forth. Okay, let us look more closely at the liberal assumptions. The classical liberal tradition focuses on the human individual person as a basic unit for any discussion on justice. The individual human person, according to them, possesses an innate dignity, and given that he or she is free and rational. Furthermore, liberalism assumes that human beings are conceived as possessing rights. The role of politics for them is, within the liberal framework, aims to protect human persons by safeguarding their rights. Multiculturalism, as already pointed out earlier, contests this liberal focus on the individual and then points out that attention be extended to not merely to human beings per se and their rights, but human beings as belonging to different cultural groups. Okay, so they will say that in a society, you don't have individuals per se, as is assumed by liberalism. In contrast, individuals are to be seen in relation with, in close proximity with the culture or cultural groups and things like that. So this is the point that multiculturalism emphasizes, and this is the point that they would say that liberalism lacks. This limitation in liberalism, as pointed out by multiculturalism, can be understood as at two different levels. One is multiculturalism bringing the descriptive dimensions within a society, or do they have normative claims in contesting liberalism, is a question that needs to be deliberated extensively. Now, to continue the debate on the relation between liberalism and multiculturalism, multiculturalism does not seek to move away from liberalism. This is the point that we have to keep in mind. It is true that liberalism is contested by multiculturalism, but then multiculturalism does not completely reject liberalism. There is some commonality that exists between liberalism and multiculturalism. It is true that multiculturalism criticizes liberalism, but the point that we must keep in mind is multiculturalism does not move away from liberalism. So there is something that is different between multiculturalism and liberalism. There is also something that is common to them. So there is a need to factor this complex relation between liberalism and multiculturalism. One way of factoring this complexity is to recognize that the attempt of the multiculturalism is to rework liberalism such that culture is taken seriously. That is, instead of looking at multiculturalism saying that we reject liberalism, they seems to be saying that there is something good in liberalism which we accept, but there is something that is missing in liberalism, namely culture, and that needs to be factored. So it is in the form of adding something to liberalism that multiculturalism seems to be shaping its trajectory. And so, according to multiculturalism, group claims are not privileged over individual claims. Individual claims are important. The only thing is that multiculturalism argues that individual persons are members of social groups. So, misrecognition of said groups would misrecognize its individual members. So let us relook at the argument more carefully. What multiculturalism seems to be saying is not to reject liberal claim about individuals' primacy. The point that they seems to be adding is individuals' claims are primary. However, individuals don't exist per se in isolation. Individuals exist in relation to other individuals, and all of them belong to groups. This cultural factor has to be factored, and that is the major claim of multiculturalist. According to Taylor, Charles Taylor is one of the important proponents of multiculturalism, and he's argued how liberalism has missed out something very, very important, and that needs to be factored. According to Taylor, human actions or choices occur against the background of shared meanings, not isolated actions or isolated ideas. So these shared meanings are expressed and constituted in a shared language. For instance, one could argue from this point of view, saying that human beings speak language, and language is not private, as brilliantly pointed out by Wittgenstein. The language is not invented by human beings. language is already there when we are born. So when we express ourselves, our individual preferences, we use language, and that language does not belong to individual persons, but is entrenched within a larger cultural group. By implication, Taylor would say, people with different languages and accompanying vocabularies would experience moral and political or ethical demands differently. Okay, so this is the point that Taylor comes to make. So Taylor is saying that there are individuals and they do express their choices, preferences, rights, and freedom, but they partake in a larger cultural matrix which is not invented by them, and they are born into it, and they speak language, and the language is not, individual constructed or created. So this is one of the major interventions on behalf of multiculturalism by a person like Charles Taylor. Now, you also have a similar arguments made by others such as Michael Sandel and Michael Wallner. Arguing from a Hegelian standpoint, Taylor claims that an individual identity is not arrived at internally but in dialogical relation with others. So there is an intersubjectivity that underlies in all our social relations, and this cannot be ignored, but Taylor points out that this is not factored within liberal doctrine, who overemphasize the primacy of the individual or the autonomous self. Therefore, Taylor would say recognition or regard of the other is important to one's self-conception. So given that the identity of an individual is bound with group identity, Charles Taylor would argue that keeping with universal equality implies that communities or groups need to be recognized as well. However, doing so should not imply violation of fundamental rights. So the point that Taylor is making is that individual rights are important, but please remember that individuals belong to a group. They are born into cultural matrix. Unless you factor this cultural or social aspect, you would not be able to get the description of an individual correct. And if you don't get the description of the individual correct, the normative realm that you are offering might be compromised. Might be compromised. So let us now move from Taylor to other important critic of liberalism, namely Michael Sandel. Michael Sandel is known for his critique of liberal conception of the subject in his famous book Liberalism and the Limits of Justice, which is published in 1982. Sandel formulates his critique of John Rawls. Sandel argues that Rawls' analysis in the theory of justice presupposes a fundamentally Kantian understanding of the self, which is the Kantian understanding of the self is an autonomous individual bereft of the cultural or other kind of shades that are outside the individual realm or the realm of the self. So to quote Sandel, the notion of human subject as a sovereign agent of choice, a creature whose ends are chosen rather than given, who comes by his aims and purposes by acts of will as opposed to, say, acts of cognition, unquote. In truth, Sandel contends that self is not so unencumbered. Rather, it is situated in a community marked by a common vocabulary of discourse and a background of implicit practices and understandings, unquote. The other critic of liberalism is Michael Wallner. On his part, emphasizes the crucial role of the shared meaning of a society in shaping the understanding of the good amongst that society's members. So the shared meaning is more important in addition to the primacy of the individual. While national character, conceived as a fixed and permanent mental set, is obviously a myth, Wallner maintains, the shared sensibilities and intuitions among the members of a historical community is a fact of life. And then he continues that moral arguments take place against the background of this shared understanding. These positions on the nature of the individual subject in relation to community suggest that one cannot arrive at universally valid conclusions about the demands of justice through the framework that entirely ignores culture. In other words, it is not possible to arrive at a normative package or a universalist conclusions as undertaken by liberalism without factoring an important aspect in individual's life, namely culture. That's the point that multiculturalism seems to be emphasizing, or putting it in the center stage. For one thing, our understanding of and our own reasoning and conclusions about what is right and good will depend upon a background of shared meanings that are specific to the culture in which we are situated. That's the larger point that multiculturalist seems to be making. For another thing, the fact that these shared meanings differ from one culture to another means that while there may be some transcultural commonalities that provide a basis for identifying some basic rights, there are also grounds for a considerable degree of pluralism. That is, if you factor culture as suggested by multiculturalists, the problem is that it has certain implications. One important implication is that there can be variation between one culture to other culture. There can be variation amongst several cultures. If there are variations at the level of culture, then they will lead to pluralism. Within certain constraints, we should respect the varying nature that provide the context of significance within which individual thinks, feels, and acts. So, multiculturalists would say, if there is difference between two cultures or amongst various cultures, the difference should not deter us from not factoring culture. Okay? We have to somehow see that we account for that difference. Okay, that's a major point that the multiculturalism seems to be pleading for. Okay, once you accept that culture is important within the nation state, then the next aspect of this acceptance comes to our mind, and this is clearly pointed out by Will Kymlicka. Kymlicka joins with other people in highlighting the importance of culture and how culture cannot be ignored. But then he gets into the details. Suppose if there are different cultures within a society or a nation state, now all cultures need not be equal. All cultures need not be equal. There can be cultures which are more dominant than the other cultures. For instance, there can be what he makes a distinction between two kinds of minorities. One is the national minorities and the other one is immigrant groups. Okay? So within a nation state, according to Kymlicka, there can be people who belong to majority and there can be people who belong to minorities. Okay? The minorities can be subdivided. Those who belong to the particular nation, they have been there since a long time, and there are people who migrated into that nation, so they are come from outside. Kymlicka argues for national minorities having group specific rights such as special representation within a government, while immigrant groups need to be granted polyethnic rights that would enable retaining those aspects of culture that would allow fair terms of integration. So that is an important point that Kymlicka makes to this discussion. Now when you move from Sandel and others to Kymlicka, now we can look at something that comes from a person who has been in the forefront of multiculturalism debate, That is Bhikkhu Parekh. Bhikkhu Parekh takes a very moderate view, and let's look at what is his position. Bhikkhu Parekh warns against the possible slide into cultural relativism. He says that cultures are important and we should recognize the difference that cultures reveal. However, if you give more importance to culture, there is a possibility where it relapses into cultural relativism. If you reach cultural relativism and if you face cultural relativism, then there is a serious problem to the liberal package. Okay, so let's look at what he says. Parekh argues for a minimalist view of human nature consisting of those capacities, desires and faculties that present among all human persons by virtue of belonging to the same species. Among them is the universal feature of the influence of culture on individuals. So there is a trait in all human beings. That trait is universal trait of cultures on human beings. Given shared nature coupled with culturally differentiated characteristic, Bhikkhu Parekh argues for a pluralistic universalism and not cultural relativism. The pluralistic aspect proves minimum moral values that need to be recognized by all human beings and includes respecting human dignity. The pluralistic aspects include acknowledging that minimum moral values are not fully applicable and that they need to be adopted to specific cultural circumstances. In other words, if you accept certain cultural states, you should not treat them as universal, but you should use them only within a specific context so that they are anchored into different context and not sublated to the status of a universalism where they can be used irrespective of the context. Okay. Now we move from the Bhikkhu Parekh to the Indian scenario where the recognition of culture was already assumed from the beginning, because unlike in the West where you have traveled from the autonomous individualism to the recognition of culture, the Indian nation state after independence, in fact, right from the beginning saw the importance of culture and how culture plays an important role in shaping the activities of individuals. According to Gurpreet Mahajan, in India, it was a result of a political negotiation with various mobilized groups within a polity that marks the nature of different communities in Indian state. So she argues that implementing majority perspective within the nation state would be harmful for minority communities. That is, if you accept that there is an Indian state and they are the majorities, and if you implement the packages that are decided by the majority, that would be harmful to minorities. That is the reason why right from the beginning in the Indian constitution there is an emphasis on protecting the rights of the minorities. For Mahajan, the Indian discourse on multiculturalism was concerned with limiting majoritarianism. That's one of the major thrusts of Indian democracy, and constitution makes ample provisions to make this possible. In doing so, the attempt is to create a favorable political climate that is accommodative to national minorities. That is, minorities should not feel that they have been under the supervision or authority of the majoritarian policies or decisions. They should also feel that they are part of the nation and they also contribute substantially. They have a sense of belonging to the nation even though they don't belong to the majority. That is, remaining as a minority, retaining the cultural diversity, yet they partake into the nation state. That is the point that the fathers of Indian constitution maintained and then saw that this is the prominently emphasized in the Indian constitution. Now let us look at a third group of people that consists of people like Brian Barry. Brian Barry opposes multiculturalism because he says that multiculturalism ultimately leads to deep diversity. And he points out that liberalism already accommodates diversity, that individual freedom is very important to liberals, and individuals' actions, preferences vary from one another. So there is already diversity. So why should we now add something else to promote diversity, particularly culture to promote diversity? So he says that if the point that multiculturalists are making is to accommodate diversity, Brian Barry's point is diversity is already factored in the initial doctrine of liberalism. If you want to bring in communities into the center stage, not merely diversity, Barry's caution is the moment you allow communities, each community will come with its own claims, and some of the claims will be more in a propaganda manner because they will propagate practices, and if you accommodate those practices might violate the liberal principles. So if you accept culture and cultural variations, then you may have to compromise the claims of liberalism. So this is the very important point that he makes. So he says that the granting of special rights is also problematic, given that cultures are not the kind of entities that rights can be ascribed to. In other words, rights are generally attributed to individuals. So if you accept culture, then you have to give cultural rights, and that is an anomaly according to him. In addition to Barry, you have people like Susan Okin, who argues that if you accept multiculturalism, if you allow culture to be an important aspect of human nature, then it is very bad for women. The implications of this to women, according to Okin, are bad. She says that all cultures, including Western ones, are patriarchal. If cultures are patriarchal, since they are patriarchal, men are most often representatives of these cultures that are patriarchal. And these men will present the unequal conditions of women as being synonymous with tradition. Granting cultural rights would be harmful for women members of the community. As opposed to multiculturalism, Okin believes that liberalism is better equipped to deal with women's rights than multiculturalism. You have Celia Ben-Habib, who is critical about multiculturalism because of their position essentializes culture. Instead of seeing cultures as meaningfully discrete wholes, Ben-Habib argues for a constructivist view. This view sees cultural identities as being dynamic and taking shape through dialogue and narrative. Ben-Habib, therefore, does not reject the politics of recognition, as pointed out by Charles Taylor, but claims that the preferable approach should accept the dynamic and fluid nature of communities. In other words, what is important to Ben-Habib is that you should not have a culture which has essentialistic overtones. You should think about culture as being dynamic, changing, and culture as dynamic and changing is preferable to culture as essentialistic or static. That's the point that Ben-Habib makes. Then you have Kwame Anthony Appiah, who claims that multiculturalism has an unstable understanding of identity. He argues that recognition ossifies cultural identity and denies their fluid nature. This is similar to the point that Ben-Habib makes. While culture is an important aspect for an individual identity, Appaya points out that group identities tends to constrict those individuals who do not wish to be part of it. Appaya recognizes the need for collective group politics on part of minority and disadvantaged communities to revise negative stereotypes, but argues that for such identities not to be scripted too tightly so as to allow individual choice and negotiation. Multiculturalism has also been criticized for taking attention away from injustice related to race. Scholars arguing this perspective include Noor Besi, Philip, and Himani Banerjee. Banerjee argues that arguments and efforts in favor of cultural recognition neutralizes potentially destabilizing anti-racist movement. This in turn allows status quo inequalities to be preserved. That is, if you accept that culture has an important role, then there are a lot of cultures that practice racism, that practice a lot of inequalities and these things, and then they will say that there are culturally unique thing for them and you can't question it. So scholars have argued that multiculturalism leads to social fragmentation given its emphasis on cultural differences. So Gurpreet Mahajan criticizes multiculturalism's focus on cultural rather than economic marginalization. She says that what is important to people is the economic marginalization and you should not bother about cultural marginalization. That's not a very important thing. Further, in recognizing the communities, there is a tendency amongst multiculturalists to homogenize communities. They think that all communities are important, so you should factor to community differences. But there can be variation between different communities and there can be variation amongst various communities. This implies that much focus is not placed on the discrimination within the community. Like, it is true that a community makes a claim within a larger whole. But what is important to remember is within the community, that community may be not as open to other people's voices as it claims the whole should be open to the community's voices. That's the point that is made. This is especially problematic in the case of gender inequality as seen with communities in India, owing to which Mahajan argues for a discursive space for the right to non-conformist membership. Okay, the point that is generally also asked is that it is true that a community is not recognized in a majoritarian nation state. But what is important is, will this community allow the dissent within the community? Will it allow the dissent within the community? And that's the point that Mahajan points out. Tariq Modood argues for multiculturalism in the context of migrant communities in Europe and Britain, especially with Muslim communities in the West. Modood claims that multiculturalism has helped in dealing with the aspects of discrimination. Defending multiculturalism's essentializing approach to culture, Modood argues that while cultures are dynamic entities, they are sociologically real and hence need to be recognized. Anna Philip argues that the category of culture cannot be done away with. For Phillips, multiculturalism should be recognized as a model for negotiating between different cultural communities. To do so, the concept of culture must not include those reified aspects which feminists find problematic while retaining those that help in addressing inequalities between cultural groups. Okay, so to sum up, we have started with the critique of liberalism that factors only the individual rights and choices and freedom. And we have discussed various philosophers who made a case for factoring culture in understanding human being. And then we looked at what are the problems that are faced, consequences met if you allow culture as an important category in understanding society. And then we have come up with a third set of people who try to avoid the excesses of both the liberal doctrine and also avoid the implications of multiculturalist recommendations. So this is a a lesson that will throw a different light on our understanding of societies, of our take on the social theory, our understanding of the merits of liberalism and also limitations of liberalism. Thank you.